Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm sure everyone is excited about a talk on patent law at 8 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, there you go. Gives me a lot of confidence, thank you. So I think I've had a chance to talk with a lot of you, so I'm not going to introduce myself other than I'm the patent attorney. I don't have a real name. I'm just the patent attorney. Go talk to him if you have a question. But I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, and I want to thank Barb and Michael for inviting me back again this year. I really enjoy this. I enjoy the interaction with the students and the other faculty, and it really actually helps my practice a lot. So I learn a lot by coming out here. Like I said, I've done this 4 or 5 years. They move me around in the schedule because I'm not sure if they know what to do with me. But I kind of like actually being on the last day because it's given me a chance to talk to a lot of the students, to get a lot of questions, and it's actually informed how I'm going to do the presentation today. What I'm presenting today is entirely different from what I brought with me. So I hope it works. If you don't see me here next year, you know that this approach didn't work. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm not going to hammer you over the head with a bunch of patent law, statutes, case law, all of that stuff, but I'm going to try to give you more practical advice and how to navigate the patent process as you develop your project and as you go forward towards commercialization. So what's a patent? I think everyone here has an idea about what a patent is. It's a grant from a government to an inventor or for the patent owner. In your case, it's usually the university. The right to exclude others from making, using, offering for sale, selling, or importing the claimed invention. So it's pretty much anything that you can do with the invention. It's excluding others from doing all of that. And that right is granted for a limited time, so that gives you what is essentially a limited monopoly on your invention. But to get that, and this is the give and take with the patent office, you have to disclose how to make and use your invention. So you can't go into a patent application hiding the ball. So you have to show people how to use your invention. So how are patents relevant to drug discovery? I think we talked a lot about this during this week. Most patent applications are filed early on in preclinical stage. One reason patents are important is it's really easy to reverse engineer a lot of drug discoveries, especially like in the small molecule space. Once you know what the chemical compound is, you can make it. It's a little harder in the biologics. That's a whole nother thing, but generally people are smart enough to reverse engineer your invention. So you need some protection. A patent will protect the fruits of your efforts. You're putting a lot of effort, a lot of money into these projects. And having a patent and being able to commercialize it encourages innovation. That's the whole philosophy behind the U.S. patent system, is to actually encourage innovation and promote the science. And patents can serve as an intangible asset for attracting investors as you go forward trying to commercialize your project. So what happens if you don't get patent protection? And so this is a hypothetical example. We have a drug that cures a fatal disease. The researchers decide they want to donate it to the public, so this drug will get out into the public faster, quicker, cheaper, and everyone will be cured of this disease. Well, a potential consequence is that because no one has exclusive rights in this drug, no one's going to put the money into it to commercialize it, to develop it, to get it through all of the things you have to do to get a drug to market. So that drug might just sit on the shelf and never get out into the public. So it's kind of counterintuitive that it would defeat the purpose. So I always show this slide, and I just think it's obvious, like no one's ever going to do this, right? So especially in this day and age where everyone's pretty savvy towards tech transfer, there's push for startups and to commercialize your invention. So of course no one's ever going to do that. Well, they did. So I think most of you might be aware of the COVID vaccine that was developed at Texas Children's Hospital and at Baylor. And the institutions and the researchers decided not to pursue patent protection on that. So it was more or less donated to the public domain. So the consequence of that, which was positive, in that countries like Indonesia, India, was widely disseminated in those countries. The cost per dose is like $2 or $3. And companies in these countries were able to ramp up quickly and produce this vaccine. The researchers were actually nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, which is probably somewhat unique for scientists to be in that category. I actually heard Dr. Bottazzi speak about this a couple weeks ago at a conference. And it's not that they're anti-patent in their group, because her group, they do a lot of rare subtropical disease type research. And they have patent portfolios on other things. This is just one thing they wanted to get out into the public. And again, not knowing all the nuts and bolts and what went into the vaccine, the way she described it, it seemed like a lot of the techniques were known already. And that was part of the value of this, was the techniques were known, the materials were readily available. And so, the patent attorney in me is thinking that, well, maybe this wasn't so patentable anyway, but it doesn't take away from what they did. So what can you do with a patent? So Maureen kind of stole my thunder the other night at dinner. She said, well, you can mount it on a bronze plaque. And I'm like, that's what I'm talking about. And you can hang it on the wall. Okay, they make great paperweights. So you can always do that. And if you get a bunch of them, you can line your whole wall or an entire corridor of the lab, right? All jokes aside, you can count it as a publication towards tenure. Check with your institution. I think nowadays institutions are recognizing the value of patents towards your tenure track. And more of what we're talking about here during this week is you can license it to a company outside the university for development, or you can form a startup around the IP. And I put in here that these were potential sources of revenue, and then I realized that maybe that is sort of a joke, that startups are a source of revenue. I think it usually goes the other way, but somewhere down the line, some of them hit, and so they can be successful. You can also sue potential infringers. That's a high initial cost to do that. You probably would need a partner, because it's like $5 million just to get in the door of a courtroom. And so if you have your portfolio licensed, a lot of times the licensee, especially if it's like big pharma, they'll carry the freight for that and direct that litigation. There's also companies that will do IP litigation on contingency, or finance it, and that's how a university can actually do it without having all the upfront money. So one thing we've talked a lot about this week that I normally don't present is what is a license agreement. Okay, so Let's say you have at least a patent on file. It doesn't have to be an issued patent, but you need something on file. Your institution can negotiate with other companies to license your IP. Your part of this equation is you probably know the players in your area, and so you can help identify potential licensees. As far as the negotiation process, your tech transfer office will do that. And you'll be involved, but they'll do the nuts and bolts of a license agreement. Okay, so this is very, very basic. Licensing could be an entire hour-long talk. Generally, your license agreement will have an upfront payment, some type of milestone payments. For example, if you complete a clinical trial or you have first in patients, as you get further along in the project, these milestones get worth more and more. And then if you commercialize the product, there will be a stream of revenue from royalties off of sales. Okay, the revenue is shared. Your institution gets a cut right off the top. The department generally gets a cut. Tech transfer office gets a cut. And then the rest is shared with the inventors. And each institution will do this differently and have different percentages. What percentage each inventor gets is kind of up to the inventors. Tech transfer office usually doesn't care. Patent, it has no bearing on the patent process, what percentage inventors get. So there is potential revenue sharing out of a license agreement. So where does patenting come in the drug discovery process? So there's a lot of things that happen early on, a lot of really important things, and I always like to say, like, you can get a Nobel Prize for some of this stuff, but you might not get a patent, right? So a lot of the early stage, the really hard science of elucidating pathways, identifying targets, and so on, a lot of that is not patentable. It can form part of your patent application and portfolio, but it's not patentable per se. So where we start getting into patentable things, assays can be. Now, they're not necessarily, some are valuable, most are maybe not. Those are hard to police. It's hard to tell what someone is actually doing in the laboratory unless you go into the laboratory and watch them. Okay. You can screen compounds, but the sweet spot is, and again, I think in more small molecules, but the sweet spot is identifying leads, optimizing those leads, and developing those leads. So a lot of times, we'll start the patent process here. And a lot of times, what we start with down here and end up over here, we might, when we draft the patent application, we might think one thing's going to be lead, and then by the time it gets closer to commercialization or in the clinic, it could be a different compound. So one thing we try to do is cover as much as we can within reason. So what can be patented? A lot of things, and we've talked a lot about that this week. I think we've hammered over and over again that composition of matter is most important and tends to be the most valuable. But that doesn't mean if you don't have composition of matter that you're dead in the water. There's other ways to get IP protection. A method of use, we've talked a lot about, we can have method of use of a novel compound, but we can also have method of use of a known compound or drug repurposing. Others have talked a little bit about that, and that's an avenue that you can always go down. Process and manufacture can be patented. One thing that sometimes is easy to overlook, if you have a chemical synthesis, sometimes the intermediates themselves are novel compounds. So we try to protect not only the active compounds, but the compounds that are intermediates to that. different forms of compounds. Again, this is sort of geared towards small molecules again. Salts, solvates, polymorphs, and prodrugs. These are actually novel compositions of matter that can be derived from the novel compound itself. You have to have data to support that, though. You can't just say a compound of Formula One and prodrugs thereof. The patent office will not give that to you.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the chloride salt and the citrate salt are different chemical matter?
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, the rub is it might be obvious to get from one to the other because there might be a limited number of salts that are available and that you'd just be picking from a list of that. There's some case law that kind of goes against just salts being novel and non-obvious. I don't agree with that case, but it could be an uphill battle, even if you have really good data. But these can also be used to prolong patent protection, and so you'll see innovative drugs when they're starting to come off patent. You'll see extended release forms and stuff like that. Same with formulations and delivery devices. Jim's talked the other day about routes of administration can be patentable. Dosing regimen and even packaging and kits can be patentable. So what do you do if you don't have a novel composition of matter? Again, this is a little redundant from the last slide, but even though if you don't have a novel composition of matter, these things are all patentable, right? So these give you a second avenue towards IP protection. And some of these are quite valuable. We had some examples of Cialis and Viagra as second medical use of a known compound, and those certainly have value. Process and manufacture, probably the best known case to come out of a university is Florida State and the semi-synthetic route to Taxol. So at the time, Taxol, what was a natural product from Pacific yew tree. There were only so many Pacific yew trees, and you could only get so much Taxol out of each tree. And the group at Florida State came up with a semi-synthetic way of making it. It was licensed to Bristol Myers back in the 90s for over $200 million. So I don't know what that equates to in today's dollars, but Florida State built a lot of buildings based on this project. Again, we talked about different forms of the compound, formulations. Now, one thing about formulations, it's a little bit tricky because the formulation is probably by definition going to be a combination of known materials or components, right? So the patent office, that's almost prima facie obvious, right? So you're going to have to demonstrate somehow in your formulation what's called the criticality of the components and their concentration ranges. So here's where you have to do a fair amount of experimentation. So if you have a formulation with 5% of one component and you've shown that works, so if you show like 1% of that component is not enough and at 10% of that component the formulation craps out, then you can show the patent office that, okay, we're working in the sweet spot. That was not obvious to anybody or is counterintuitive, or other people have tried these formulations and failed. So you have to have experimental data to show, to reason with the patent office why you have your formulation the way it is. So you can't just mix stuff together and say, oh, well, it's new. They're going to say that it's obvious. Another area that you can also look at is a dosing regimen. So you can have a specific dose range. Again, you'll have to show the criticality of that range. And you can also show like a dosing cycle. So you can have dosing on, and then off for 2 weeks, then back on, or you can have like a huge amount for a couple days, then smaller amounts to maintain. But again, you have to have a lot of data that shows the efficacy of that. So there are different categories of U.S. patents. What we are mainly concerned with are what's called utility patents. And they are most important for, and really the only thing that you'll probably ever be doing. Other types of patents are business methods, design patents, so like it's an ornamental design like the shape of the Coke bottle, and then also plant patents. But we're going to be talking today exclusively about what are referred to as utility patents. So there are different kinds. You probably heard of a provisional patent application. This is typically the first application that you would file. It's submitted to the patent office. It automatically goes abandoned after 1 year from the filing date. So you have to decide somewhere during that 1 year if you want to go forward with a full application. Now, the provisional patent application is held in confidence by the patent office during that year, so nobody knows that you filed it, okay? And if, for example, you say at the end of that 1 year, we're not going forward with this project, we're gonna let that provisional patent application go abandoned, it just disappears as if it was never there. So no one can ever find it. The trick is that if you do go forward with a non-provisional application, that application publishes 18 months after your original filing date. At that time, your file is kind of open to the public. And so the provisional patent application doesn't publish per se, but it's publicly available. So you want to be careful about what you put in the provisional application. You don't want to put anything stupid. You don't want to put anything that you might want to hold back and keep maybe as a trade secret or some type of data that you just don't want to be out into the public. Because once it's in the provisional application, you can't redact it. Okay, so it's there. It will become publicly available in 18 months. So a provisional application can be relatively informal, but it does require a written description of the invention. Under current U.S. patent law, this has become more rigorous. So typically, I say you can file a provisional application quick and dirty, but we tend to draft fully drafted applications as provisionals so that we get full written description of the invention and get a priority date for as much subject matter as we can. Okay, we don't have to draft claims, but we like to because that helps to define the invention. The main thing that you're looking for with the provisional application is to get a priority date for prior art purposes. So the more fully developed the application can be, the better your priority date. And examiners will look. So I've had examples where I don't get a priority date on a provisional because I'm claiming something that I've added later. You have to have drawings if they're necessarily, of course, the filing fee, and what's called a cover sheet. Yes?
What do you mean by priority date?
Okay. So once you get to a fully drafted application, submit that to the patent office. It's reviewed by a patent examiner, and they will do what's called a prior art search, and they will search from your priority date backwards, okay? So you don't want, in that 1 year pendency of your provisional application, you don't want any intervening prior art. So you want that priority date to be as solid as possible. Because the prior art will be a big chunk of what determines your patentability. And a lot of times, excuse me, in the university setting, a lot of the times the prior art is your own art, your own previous work. So we had to file what's called a cover sheet that lists the names of the inventors. You have to have at least one inventor, the title of the invention, and the source of government funding. So always remember if this is supported by federal funding. And you might have heard the term cover sheet provisional before, and that is a really quick and dirty application where, for example, if you call me on Friday at 5 o'clock and say I'm presenting at a conference on Sunday and I need to protect this, here's my slide deck, I'll take your slide deck, slap a cover sheet on it, and file what I call a cover sheet provisional. And that is a real world thing that for some reason 5 o'clock Friday is a busy time for patent attorneys. Okay, so what happens next? You file what's called a non-provisional application. This can be in the US. It can be what's called an international PCT application. I'll talk a little more about that later. Or you can directly file in a foreign country. So this is more formal now. So we have sections of the application that need to be completed. These include an abstract, the background of the invention, summary, all the figures and drawings, a written description, and the claims. So the claims are the most important because that's what a court will determine the scope or the metes and bounds of your invention for potential infringement. Okay, so a lot of times a patent attorney, if you've worked with patent attorneys, they'll work backwards. So you give them all of this stuff, and a couple days later they come back with a set of claims that you look at and they make absolutely no sense to you, right? Because it's a total foreign language. But we try to understand the invention, distill it down to words, and then build the application around that. So if we go now, we've drafted the claims, we go to the written description and try to expand the scope of those claims or support those claims within the body of the application. The figures are going to be there. The summary of the invention, what I do, it might seem lazy, but there's a reason behind it, is I just put the claims, which are normally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, I put them into narrative form. The reason I do that is because some courts will construe what's in the summary of the invention, or even in the abstract of the invention, as like claim subject matter. Why they do that, I don't know. Because if it's in the claims, it's in the claims. So this is just cut and paste. I also cut and paste into the written description. So there's a lot of redundancy in the way I draft applications, and other attorneys as well. So don't get mad at your patent attorney and say, oh, it's just a bunch of redundancy and boilerplate. Everything is there for a reason. And then up in the background, I tend to be very brief here because you don't want to put something in the background that a court could construe as prior art that can work against you. So here, it's the less you say, the better. So what does a patent look like? This is the front page of an issued patent. This actually came out of Barb's group, so it has the first inventor, patent number, the date that the patent issued, all the inventors, all of these codes here that the Patent Office uses to search the invention. Don't ask me what the codes mean. Here would be a listing of the prior art that we have a duty and you have a duty. Everyone involved with the patent application has a duty of candor before the Patent Office to disclose anything that you're aware of that might be pertinent to patentability. Okay, so anything that we know of, we will submit. It's called an information disclosure statement. We submit that to the Patent Office. The patent examiner will do their own search, but a lot of times they rely on what we give them. And then everything that was disclosed is listed on the patent. And then there's me, and then the abstract. And I like this example. Again, it's a small molecule example, but it's an interesting way of claiming this compound. One thing that I like working with Barb's group is they tend to know what they want to go after. They're very patent savvy and coming from industry. They have a lot of experience here. And so this is a compound where we had the opportunity to do more variation here, if we wanted to. But we knew that this had to be hydroxyl. We knew that the carbonyl group had to be here. We had the nitrogens had to be in the ring. We had some variability here where the X could be oxygen or sulfur. We had some variability here in the length of this chain here, but we didn't go too extreme. But look at R1, right? So that's basically anything I could think of, and we got it, okay? We don't always get that, but we got really broad coverage for this particular R group. But this is what a claim looks like. These things here, like every time we define X or R1, these are called Marcouche groups. So it just goes back to a name of a case that was Marcouche. And it's just a way that we draft the claims. So one thing that you can do as you're developing your project, you can do some patent searching on your own. There's different publicly available websites that you can use to search. The first two here that I've given you are the USPTO. They just changed how they do things. They have this thing called Patent Center now. The way they used to do it was kind of archaic, but it worked. For the life of me, I can't do anything in Patent Center. And I don't think it's just me. It's like I'm not like turning into get off my lawn kind of guy with the patent office, but nobody I know can do searching on the new. It's how they released it, I don't know. So that's my rant for the day. So WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Organization. That's where your international PCT application ends up. This is actually the field combination search for them, which actually works, and it's pretty easy to navigate. Another good site is the European Patent Office, the eSpaceNet, and that actually gives you kind of worldwide patents. So it's not just European patents. It'll give you Japanese patents, Chinese patents, US patents. And then, of course, Google figured out how to do patent searching better than the Patent Office. So you can, I think a lot of people go to Google Patents just by default. So one big question that comes up in academia is when to file your patent application. So actually today's the anniversary, right, of the U.S. changing the patent laws 10 years ago. They went from a first to invent to a first to file. So it used to be you could use lab notebooks to show that you actually invented something before you filed the patent application. Now it's a pure when did you file. So it's kind of a race to the patent office. And this harmonizes the U.S. patent law with most other countries. And so ideally, obviously you want to be the first to file, right? So when is that? In your case, a lot of times the trigger that determines when you file is a publication or a presentation date. Okay. So it's harder in academia to hold on to your data and wait until your project's fully developed. So, and we heard yesterday the constant pressure to publish, and you have to get grants, you have to do all of this stuff, so you can't hold off and wait for patent filings. The disadvantage is that you have to absorb the patent cost earlier, but you can use the patent application to attract investors or start up a company. The later filing gives you opportunity to develop or evaluate the invention further, focus on patent protection on preferred embodiments, or defer cost. So I know different labs are set up differently, and so you might not have much control over when you file. So the process of filing a patent application, we talked about the provisional application. It has a 1-year pendency, so at the 12-month date, you have to decide if you want to file a U.S. utility or this PCT international application. At that point, it's a fully drafted application. You can't add any more data to it. 18 months, it automatically will publish. In the U.S., you can file a petition to withhold the publication, but that doesn't happen very often. If you file this international application at 30 months or 31, different countries have different deadlines, you can enter what's called the national stage. So this PCT application is a placeholder application for foreign filings. And you see the time frame here. You might think, well, that's a long time, but that actually works in your favor in academia. So file the provisional, you're covered because you just presented. You have a year to develop the data more, and then you have up to 30, 31 months to attract a licensee, right? So your tech transfer office during this whole time of pendency of this application, you're deferring the actual substantive examination. And you can use this now to attract a licensee or investors. The process can be somewhat long. This is a little shorter now than what I have. But the examination process in the patent office can take a while. So it could be like 5 or 6 years from the time you file till you actually get a patent to issue. There's a joke. I had a colleague who was working with an individual inventor, and they filed a patent application one day, and the next day he gets a call from the inventor, and he's like, hey, I'm at the patent office, like I came to pick up my patent, and they say they can't find it. What happened? So the guy thought that once they filed it with the patent office, the next day he could go pick up his patent. So yeah, maybe 5 years later, but certainly not the next day. There are mechanisms. If you pay more money, you can get final disposition of a patent within 1 year. And I've done that a fair amount, and that's a lot of companies will do that if they have money to put into it. So you know within 1 year either it's allowed or it's finally rejected. Okay, so what happens during the patent process? So this is sometimes a mystery to inventors, especially if you haven't been through this process before. The provisional application, it's a placeholder. It just sits there. It's not examined. Again, nobody knows that you did it. During this 1 year pendency, you can file one or more provisional applications, and I like to do this. Let's say we file an application, then 6 months later you come back to the tech transfer office and you say, I've got a really good data set, can I file on this? And we'll file a second provisional and tacking on the new data to the original filing. And we still have the original priority date, so right, that's important. But now we're adding data as we go during this 1 year pendency. And we can do this as many times as you want. Now the trick is that every time you file, though, the new data will be given a different priority date. So you can have a provisional application or a non-provisional application with multiple priority dates. So just bear that in mind. Yes?
When you search for patents, would all the provisional patents come up separately, or do they get, when it goes online or whatever,
You have to
does
dig.
it all be combined together?
You have to dig for them.
Okay, they're not going to be shown together.
So you'll do a patent search. You'll find either the PCT application or the US application. If you go down into the file history, it'll show the priority documents, and then you can pull those up. But it won't, like when you do a search, you won't get a list of provisional applications. You'll get the non-provisionals. And so you have to dig one step further to get the priority documents. And so I keep mentioning this. Yes?
file the provisional patent and after 1 year let it expire,
Mm-hmm.
and I file another provisional patent for the same thing, would the previous provisional patent count as a prior art for my new file, or is not?
Now, that's a really good question, and you have to be careful in how you do that. So the question is, if you file a provisional application, after 1 year you let it lapse, you're not ready to go forward, and you run the risk of prior art, right, intervening prior art, but you file a second provisional application, that is now considered your first provisional. The first one is not even there. Okay, where you run into trouble is if there's overlap, right? So if you file the second provisional before the first one expires, now the second provisional is not the first provisional, and for the PCT to get priority, it has to be the first provisional. So you either have to let it naturally expire at the end of that 1 year, or if you wanted to do it like at 7 months after the first filing, you have to expressly abandon the first one before you file the second one. Okay, so you have to be careful, but that is a strategy. Okay, so what's this PCT application I keep talking about? It's a placeholder for foreign filings. So it goes to the World Intellectual Property Organization. It sits there. It does have a non-binding examination by a patent examiner. You can choose which country you want to have it examined. We typically choose the cheapest, whichever country at that point in time is the cheapest, or you can use the US. So you'll get an international preliminary report on patentability and a written opinion. So this is a search, and this is an examination based on that search. Now, this is non-binding, but smaller countries that you might go into might use that as their examination process. But the important thing for you is it gives you a snapshot of what you might expect later in terms of prior art, how the examiner is going to apply the prior art. So if you see something in this, and if it's a negative report, you do have a chance to amend the application. You can amend your claims. You can also fix parts of the application as well, but you can amend the claims based on this, so when you go into the US and other foreign jurisdictions, you don't have to deal with that art anymore. Okay. Now, importantly, you cannot add new data. So once you file either this PCT or the US application, you're locked in. Okay, so you can't add new data. Okay, what happens during US prosecution? The application will undergo formality processing, and it might sit there for a couple years with nothing really happening. It gets assigned to an examiner in an art unit. These will be examiners who have expertise in your area, and there's many layers of these art units, so you get someone who's fairly specialized and should know your technology. The first thing they will issue is called a restriction requirement. Okay, and this is the part that nobody ever understands, and they get angry. Inventors get angry. This is non-substantive, and it's the patent office's way of saying that we will only let you have one invention for your filing fee. So it's a way for the patent office to make more money, right? So the excuse is that it would be a burden on the examiner to search more than one invention, but the reality is this is a way of the patent office to generate fees. But what happens? So we have to pick whatever invention we want to prosecute at that time. So we have to pick a group of claims. So if we have a claim set that's compounds and methods of treatment, we'll usually pick the compound claims, right? And so within those compounds, then you have to elect one species of the compound. So you take your lead usually, and that's where the patent examiner will start their search. That doesn't mean you're going to end up with just that one compound, but that's where they start their search. They'll search backwards until they find something, then that's where they draw the line of patentability, and that's where you start fighting with the patent office. Okay? So does that mean you lose the other species or the other groups of claims? No. You can prosecute those in one or more divisional, they're called divisional applications. Okay, so this is based off of a restriction requirement. So once you do that, you go into substantive examination. You'll get what's called a non-final office action. This is where the examiner's done a search, they've applied the art to your claims, and this is where people get upset because they don't like rejection, right? Nobody likes rejection. So this isn't like your grant got rejected. And so this is just part of the process. And I like to say if I get a first office action allowance, then I didn't do a very good job drafting the claims because I drafted them too narrowly, right? So if you hear someone brag, oh, I got first office action allowance, it means I probably had a bad patent attorney. So we get this, and like everything else, you get angry because it's like, how could they reject my application? We file a response. We usually have to amend the claims and make arguments with the examiner. Chances are you'll get what's called a final office action or a final rejection. Now you can really get angry because it's final, right? But in the patent office, nothing. Final doesn't mean final. It just means a second rejection. And in fact, and I don't know if I do this correctly or not, but it's sort of a game of cat and mouse with the patent office. So even responding to the first office action, it's kind of like feeling out, well, what do I think the examiner might give me? Okay, some people don't like to do it like that. Some like to get allowance right after that, but I like to kind of feel, kind of see where I can go with this. Then we get a final office action that's not final. We could respond to that, and when we do that, we restart prosecution over again. It's with the same examiner, the same art stays there, the prior art stays there. It's just another round in the process. Now, I say you can rinse and repeat. You can do this as often as you can. It costs money each time, but you can this can go on forever. Now, if you feel like you're going on forever, you can always interview the examiner. Yes?
So if the cycle is going on forever and other people are doing things in the meanwhile, you still have the...
You still have your priority date.
Okay.
But you want to get this done, and you don't want it to linger. You can have interviews with the examiner over the telephone. For some reason, the patent office doesn't know that Zoom exists, so it's really hard to get an examiner to do Zoom or WebEx. And if you have a really difficult examiner, you can file an appeal, and this would be an appeal to the patent board. I usually use that as kind of like a threat to the examiner. They don't like to be overturned on appeal. So a lot of times I'll file an appeal brief, and it'll start back into prosecution, and I'll get something allowed. Okay, how long do patents last? 20 years. You can get some extension of patent term adjustment due to delays in the patent office, and also patent term extension due to delays in the FDA approval process. This is a chart that just shows that you start the patent application filing here. You see it's early preclinical stage. The protection would go to 20 years. A lot's happening in between. And you can get what's called Hatch-Waxman extension at the end of your patent term. So what is that? They calculate it as 50% of the time spent in initial clinical trials, plus 100% of the time spent in the new drug application process, and an additional 5 years of post-drug approval, but no more than 14 years total from FDA approval. So you can get, so you say, well, I get 20 years on my patent, but I'm going through this FDA process, by the time I'm done with it, I won't have any patent term left. This gives you some additional term on top of what the patent office gives you. And what if you don't have a patent? There are FDA exclusivity provisions. Orphan drugs, you get 7 years. New chemical entity, even if it's not under patent for 5 years. Yes?
What do you mean, what if you don't have a patent?
That I mean, that you don't have a patent. So this is ways that you can get exclusive marketing rights to a drug if you're not under patent.
But not if someone else has patented it already?
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. So for orphan drugs, you can get 7 years. The new chemical entity 5, a new use is something that's already gone through the FDA process, 3 years. Pediatric exclusivity, 6 months added to your existing patent or exclusivity. And then first to file generic, it's 180 days. Okay. One thing I wanted to talk about was the differences between inventorship and authorship. So authorship, you're in a university environment. You're operating under academic norms, and you often encouraged to include everybody. So you could have the PI, postdoc, grad student, technician on down the list. These can have implications related to academic reputation and advancement, but they do not raise a presumption of inventorship. So inventorship requires a contribution to the conception of the invention. It's a legal determination established by case law mostly, and I think you'll find that parties who contribute only to routine experimentation typically are not inventors. This is where we talk about someone being a pair of hands. And in terms of like if someone is just a pure technician, they are probably not an inventor. Now this is important because incorrect inventorship can invalidate or make a patent unenforceable. So what is conception? That's a good question. It's the formation in the mind of the inventor of a definite and permanent idea, so it's not just an idea, of the complete and operative invention as it will be applied in practice. An idea is definite and permanent if it has a specific settled idea, a particular solution to the problem at hand, and not just a general goal or research plan. Okay, so the patent law really never defines an invention, but it defines what an inventor is, but you can't have an invention without an inventor, right? So this kind of gives you some guidelines of where you are in your project and when is it ready for patenting. Chemical compounds have a special place in inventorship law. Conception of a chemical compound requires you can envision the structure of the chemical compound, and if there's a known way of making it, it is constructive reduction to practice. So you don't have to actually make the chemical compound to actually claim it in a patent application. For biologic material, the product is not conceived until one can define it other than by its biological activity or function. So again, you have to know the structure. You can't just know the function. We'll see that in some of the antibody case law. Criteria for patentability, there's subject matter provision you have to meet, utility, which is the very low bar. It has to have some use, has to be novel, non-obvious. You have to comply with written description, enablement, and best mode requirements. Written description is that you have possession of the invention. Enablement, you show how to make and use it. And best mode, it's not really applied very much, and honestly, you don't have to really include that. I don't know why that's not an issue. So what can be patented? just about anything that new and useful process, machine, manufacture, composition of matter, or any improvement. What cannot be patented, laws of nature, natural products or phenomena, abstract ideas or mental processes. Some jurisdictions have a more rigid requirement for medical or surgical procedures or methods of treating humans based on ethical reasons, but there's ways to craft the claims to get around that. It used to be that this is Section 101, and you might have heard about that. It wasn't a big deal. So it goes back to a case in 1980, Diamond versus Chakrabarty. Diamond was the director of the PTO at that time. Chakrabarty had developed a genetically engineered bacterium that would eat oil and oil spills. Okay, at that time, natural things were not patentable by the USPTO, but the Supreme Court ruled that a live, artificially engineered microorganism is patentable. And the key phrase that came out of this case was anything under the sun that is made by man. Okay? So that is what's patentable subject matter. This and the Bayh-Dole Act kind of opened the doors to the biotech revolution in the 1980s. And then, over time, that's been reduced. So we had some important cases. Mayo case, you've probably heard, the Myriad breast cancer gene case. Mayo was a diagnostic method. You give a patient a drug, you measure the amount of the drug, and then if it's below a certain amount, you give them more drug. If it's above a certain amount, you give them less drug. So they struck that case down, saying that it was a natural phenomena because of what your body's doing to the drug. And then also it's a mental process that you're just trying to patent what a doctor would think. So that got knocked down. That really hurt the diagnostic space. Then the Myriad case was the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. They actually had patents on the genes themselves. Okay, and so then Myriad developed diagnostic tests to see if you carried this gene and were at risk for breast cancer. So one thing that happened here was Myriad was very stingy with the licensing. Like, no one could do anything with these genes unless they went through Myriad, and Myriad didn't license it. And so all kinds of people came into ACLU, came in. All of these non-patent people came in to attack Myriad, and that was struck down, and now you cannot patent a product of nature. So I just listed a few things here that can be patentable. There's a distinction between the US and Europe. So if you can't get it in the US, you might want to try Europe. According to Myriad, isolated genes are no in the US. cDNA, though, is yes. Naturally occurring non-naturally occurring polynucleotide proteins and other sequences, yes. Vaccines, yes, and so on. These are on the slides if you want to look at them. So one thing, this could end up being probably the most important slide, is that the criteria for patentability and novelty. So you're entitled to a patent unless the claimed invention was patented or described in a printed publication in public use on sale or otherwise available to the public before the effective filing date, which is your priority date. Okay. So this is novelty. It has to be exactly the same as your invention. So each and every claim element must be disclosed in a single reference. In the US, you have a 1-year grace period. So what's a printed publication? It's just about anything. So it can be a patent application, a thesis, dissertation, other references in a library, presentations at scientific conferences, including the pre-publication of the abstract. This is the one that always gets us. Because we know when you're going to publish, but we don't or we know when you're going to present, the day and the time of your presentation, but we don't know when that abstract maybe was published online. The examiners will find it. Even internet posts, internet archives, catalogs, technical brochures, some grant applications become publicly available, or anything otherwise available to the public. Now, this can be novelty destroying, okay? So this can blow you completely out of the water. So we have to really pay attention to any public disclosure that you have. So what happens if you have a public, yes?
Quick question. Preprints like BioRevex, do those
Yep.
prints count?
Yep, publicly available, yeah.
So, but what about an abstract? Usually it describes very general phenomenon, so how?
And that's where the fight is, right? So you have an abstract published and we say the abstract was not enabling, and the patent office says, yeah, it was. So it depends on how much is disclosed in there. And maybe if you have a compound and you call the compound by name, but you don't show the structure, then nobody knows at that time what it was. So what do you do if something became publicly available before you file? Don't panic. I'll panic. You don't have to panic. In the U.S., there's the grace period. There's a bit of a catch, and this is where the tension between inventorship and authorship can come in. So you have a publication that lists A, B, C, and D as co-authors, but your patent application only lists A, B, and C as co-inventors. So what happens for the purposes of the patent office, this publication is by someone else. It's not by the inventors, it's by another, right? Because D is another person. So they can apply that as prior art. So to get around that, we can file an affidavit that from one of the inventors saying that the inventive part of what was in the publication is the inventor's own work and not the work of D, and whatever went into the patent application is only due to the inventive contribution of A, B, and C, okay? So it's a bit of a trick. You have to be honest about it because there's penalties, like you can go to jail if lying about that. Now, the U.S. has the 1-year grace period, so you're usually okay in the U.S. Other jurisdictions have grace periods of 12 months or 6 months. The big catch is good markets like Europe and China don't have this. So they're absolute novelty. I'm running a little bit behind, so I'm going to go past some of these. I have 20 slides at the end that show case studies of chemical molecules. One thing that we want to talk about is obvious that the novelty hurdle is usually pretty easy to overcome. The fight is usually on obviousness. Now, and what distinguishes obviousness over novelty is the examiner can use multiple references. So they can start piecing together references and come up with your invention. Now, they're not supposed to use hindsight in doing this, but that's human nature. And so they look at your invention and say, okay, I've got this reference, that's part of it, then I get this reference, and that's part of it, and I can bring this reference in over here, and now I have your invention that was obvious. So that's where the fight is. And one thing that we can do to fight obviousness rejections is we can bring in post-filing data, so we can show that others had failed, that we did this and failed, like out of a list of 100 compounds, 30 didn't do anything, and the rest did, and then these were the best. We can show that we had commercial success, for example, and so we can bring in all of these post-filing data to support a non-obviousness. The other criteria that we need to look at are written description, enablement, and best mode. Again, written description is you're in possession of the invention as of the filing date. Enablement is that you show someone how to make and use your invention. The differences between these, written description is locked in as of your filing date, so you only have what's in the application. Enablement, again, you can use post-filing data to show enablement. One of the bigger cases, and again, this is an important slide, you've heard of the Rochester case maybe. So this was University of Rochester discovered and cloned the gene that produces COX-2. Okay, and so they had a patent that was issued that a method for selectively inhibiting COX-2 activity in a human host, administering a non-steroidal compound that selectively inhibits the COX-2 gene. And so COX-2 and COX-1, COX-2 was the pain, COX-1 caused stomach issues or GI issues. So you didn't want something that acted on both. This was Celebrex, by the way. But what the patent or the court said that you didn't have anything, right? So it's just a non-steroid compound. They didn't have any compounds, so they failed the written description requirement. So here's an example. If you have a target, if you know you modulate that target, you can treat a disease. But if you don't have anything that you know will modulate it, you're not going to get a patent to issue. The big area that written description comes into is antibodies. This is an area that's still rich in case law, and it's still ongoing. There were these three main cases for antibiotics. The Synacor case, at this time, you could define the antibody if you had a novel epitope, and you didn't even have to have the antibody if you could describe the epitope. So the Synacor case said that you actually had to have possession of the antibody. Okay. Then the AbbVie case had 300 examples of antibodies in the application to help to support a broad genus, and somehow the court said that wasn't enough, and they didn't have structural similarity, and so the question is, what's enough? I don't think, and the answer is there's never enough, right? And so these cases are just restricting what you can and can't claim in the antibody space. And the last case is the Amgen case, which is still, I need to update this slide, it's still ongoing. It's been up and down and up and down and up and down in the courts, and it's most recently been brought up to the U.S. Supreme Court. In November, they granted certiorari for it. So Amgen has been denied this patent over and over again because it fails the written description and enablement requirement. Amgen is taking it to the Supreme Court, which you might think is a good thing because maybe they'll get the lower decision overturned. But taking patent cases to the Supreme Court is never a good thing because they tend to muddy things up. So if you look at a summary of where we are, so the Synacor case, you need the actual antibody to demonstrate possession. AbbVie, even a large number of antibodies and epitopes won't support a broad functional claim without common structural features. And the Amgen case, you can no longer claim antibodies via their epitope. And that puts a limit on what's called functional claiming. So now in the US, you pretty much have to have the sequence of the antibody. So you have to know what it is structurally. The last area that I'm going to talk about is AI. And so the answer to the question about AI is I don't know, because it's very early on in what's going on in the patent office and in the courts. So the main questions are, can AI be an inventor? And what aspects of the AI process are patentable? So under current US law, inventorship is limited to a natural person. And we were joking last night, well, what's an unnatural or non-natural person? But it has to be a person, okay? The Patent Office denied a petition for inventorship of AI in an application, and that decision was upheld at a district court and federal court. These, as far as I know, are the only cases now in this area. So for right now, in the US, AI cannot be an inventor, it has to be a real person. The courts haven't really addressed the question of whether inventions are made by humans with the assistance of AI. What are they going to do with that? The USPTO, to their credit, is not putting their head in the sand. They are engaging with the public, with academia, and requesting comments on their policy regarding AI. So if you look at the AI process, and this is very, very basic, so you can have a training data set, your input data set, what I call the black box, which has all the algorithms in it, an output, and whether you couple it with a device, and what's patentable and not patentable. So the training data set, there's a good chance you get that from the public domain, so that would not be patentable. Your input data, depending on how you transform that data, might have a patentable concept to it. The black box, if you have unique algorithms, how you're doing this, could be patentable, but most of these people don't patent stuff because they change it the next day, right? So patents will take at least a couple years to get. By the time they get a patent, what they're doing, they're not even using anymore. And then you also have all the abstract idea and mathematical algorithm case law to get around as well. So where the fight's going to be is what to do with the output, right? Who's the inventor of the output could be patentable because it might be, probably will be something novel, but who contributed to that? Was it the person who did the algorithm? Was it the person inputting the data? Or was it the black box? We don't know. So just to summarize, what I've talked about, some do's and don'ts in the patent process. Number one, get to know the folks in your tech transfer office. You may not like them, but you have to work with them. They're actually good people. Timely submit invention disclosures. Make sure you keep the tech transfer office up to date on any publications, presentations that you're going to do. You have to know what federal funding was being used. Make tech transfer offices aware of any patent applications you file with any other institutions. They don't like surprises in the tech transfer office, so don't go out here and file a patent application with somebody else and not tell your tech transfer people. We talked about a lot of conflict of interest yesterday in our exercise. Make sure you know your role if you have a startup or your role in consulting with companies and how that might in fact impact the IP of your institution. And finally, be nice to your patent attorney. Okay, so review drafts, return things in a timely manner, and don't circumvent the tech transfer office because that's where I get fired. So that concludes my talk. I'm sorry I ran over.
Got a lot of questions here,
Your
Jeff.
mic, I'm closer, we'll start here.
Okay, just two quick questions regarding the provisional finding. So you mentioned if you file a provisional and later on you decide not to pursue it, so it's naturally expire, right, after 1 year. Mm-hmm. And I just want to confirm with you, later on, this material will not be published because you also mentioned somehow 18 months they will be available to public.
Okay, so if the provisional application expires,
yeah,
and you don't, and you do not go forward with a non-provisional application,
yeah,
it just disappears. No one knows it's there. No one can find it.
Okay.
Okay. It's only if you go forward then after 18 months, people can dig in and find what you put in the provisional.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So a second question, still provisional. So do you recommend inventors to file the provisional as early as possible, or when they probably wait a little bit when they have more data or new data to file a little bit later?
So once you file a provisional, then you have new data? Is that the question?
Yeah. I just the time. So sometimes you have some data connected, right?
Yeah.
You can file a provisional, but you have more new data coming in a timely manner. Did you recommend to wait a little bit or just immediately file that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you have a good data set, to go ahead and file a second provisional within that 1 year pendency, and you can just stack them on top of one another. So you want to always get the earliest priority date for anything. And so a lot of times people will wait till the end of the year to add new data to the PCT application or US utility, but I like the concept of doing rolling provisionals.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi. So I have a question regarding the novelty. So sometimes in review papers, they put perspective or future directions that the field should take. And when you're trying to fight with the patent officer, they said no. They are saying that precision medicine is something that, and whenever you have the techniques to do it, it's obvious to do it, and it's not novel because it's already published. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I call
If
those
it's not
throwaway
data
lines,
supported.
right? At the end, the last line of a manuscript, you say, oh, future directions is this, right? And so the patent examiner will pick up on that. So, don't put that in your publication. I don't put it in the patent applications, but, if your publication
Oh, no,
is out there.
what I'm saying is that not in the patent application.
Right.
The officer, the patent officer, the governmental person says, oh, in the future directions, they said that this is the way to go.
Yeah.
So how can I claim novelty from that?
Yeah, well, a lot of times you can, it's not novelty, but the patent examiner will say it's obvious, right? And so you can argue that that particular line wasn't enabling for one of ordinary skill in the art to take the next step, or you can show that you did take that next step and it didn't work out so well, so you had to go off in a different direction. So there's different ways to argue around it, but those can be problematic. I mean, you're correct.
Thank you so much. This is so helpful. I have two questions. The first one hopefully will be quicker, the second a little bit longer. The first one's in terms of international collaborations, how does that work with IP and patents? The second one's regarding stakeholders. So, I think there's a lot of interest in the rare disease space now to make sure that the family groups and the foundations are really owning a lot of the data, like the patient data. And so, are there discussions about sharing IP or sharing patent with nonprofit organizations or family groups? Because I know it's certainly in the rare disease space always a concern about this.
Okay, so collaborating with foreign inventors can be a little bit tricky because some countries, for example, in China, if any of the research was done in China, you have to file your patent application in China first, okay? So you have to kind of be aware of what jurisdictions your inventors are in and what the patent laws are, because you might have to file in their country first before you file in the US. The second question, as far as sharing data and IP with families and foundations, I think that's up to you and your tech transfer office to negotiate. I can see the value in that, and there's no reason not to. You could give, a license to a foundation where they don't have to pay anything. Right?
So I have a question about if you have like a molecule, small molecules structure. I know you mentioned you have a example where you have R1, R2, R3, but if you have like a set structure and you want to patent that, but then you're going to make like analogs or derivatives, so how you can protect that? Because you mentioned, you gave the example when you have R1, R2, R3, and then you gave, but if you have a structure set and you want to say, okay, well, I'm going to make new analogs, how you can protect that?
Yeah, so that can be tricky too. If you file on just one compound, it's very easy to get around, right? But you also don't want to, if you're early stage in your research, you want to file a patent application, and you know that you're going to be doing things later on, you don't want to get really, really broad and create prior art against yourself for your later applications. Okay, so it's tricky to navigate because if you go really, really broad, the patent office will say, well, you haven't enabled all of those embodiments because you only made one, so you don't get anything. And then later on, you've made the analogs, you try to patent those, the patent office will say, well, your earlier application, even though it wasn't enabled, right, can still be prior art against your future work. So it's a tricky space to navigate.
So you go one by one?
And well, you try to think of maybe what you anticipate that you might do and what you can do. Right.
So you can put it in one patent or just do, okay, I have this, I will patent this now if I make a new analogs?
Well, ideally, what you would do is maybe file a provisional application on what you have at the time, and then get real busy during that next year and make the analogs.
Can you mention what kind of expenses you're looking at for each stage in the process?
Yeah. So the filing fees for a provisional are $150. Okay. I mean, for a fully drafted application, the attorney fees could be $5,000 to $10,000, depending on the complexity of the application. The real expense is when you go to foreign countries. For example, just the filing fees in Europe are like $7,500. And if you go to 20 countries, that adds up really fast. And then at each stage, it's probably like $2,500 to respond to an office action. So you can get up into the hundreds of thousands really quickly with a large patent portfolio.
So, quick question. So, in your Marcuse structure that you showed, you have the R1 equals universe, and but you have not made all of this compound. And if someone actually made one of those compounds, which is covered by this Marcuse structure, so that person cannot patent his compound because you have Marcuse structure covered already. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So let me see if I can get this right without confusing everybody. So the Marcuse structure with all the different variables would be called a broad genus. Okay, and you can still patent a species within that genus, okay, if it was not explicitly covered in the application. So you're going to have to fight over that potential prior art, but you can still get a species underneath that genus. So you can still do that.
Okay, thank you.